Good day and welcome to the big picture report covering economics, politics, and related for the 6 months to the 30th of June 2025. We also will take some of the commentary up to more recently. This is being shot in the beginning of August, and then also obviously we're looking a little bit further out. I really didn't want to start with slides on Donald Trump, but unfortunately, just it's or impossible to not feature him prominently. As that graphic shows, he really did set out to be the bull in the china shop, and he's done it very, very effectively. And arguably, and in our opinion, it has come at possibly the worst possible time. Because we've seen sort of a general malaise economically and a lack of certainty. So arguably, the rewriting of the world order and causing confusion and anxiety around economics and politics and also, issues around, military supports, etc., is all coming at a very, very awkward time in the world's history. Then I think we spoke at length in our January video about how it was the lower income cohorts, sort of those households with income under $50,000 that really helped get Donald Trump over the line. And that at the time, and we reiterate that we think that as we've seen significant cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and food support for lower income families, may very well see that that sort of rights push or red push maybe give way, and you could very well see that manifesting in some significant changes in the 2026 midterms. We have to say, not that we're political analysts, but it does look as though the Democratic Party is in somewhat a state of chaos and are unable to seemingly put a sensible argument together on why they deserve more support. I think the one thing that is interesting is at the time we spoke of 6 months ago, we spoke about Elon Musk being Mr. Fix-It, Mr. Doge, as expected by almost everybody around the world. Unfortunately, that bromance ended quite suddenly, but also quite acrimoniously, and you've seen Elon Musk forming the new, what he calls this new center party, America Party, but most importantly, vowing to put all his money behind getting any Republicans that supported the big beautiful bill out of power. So money is important in U.S. politics, and particularly in the election cycles. And we have no doubt that Elon Musk will be a force to be reckoned with politically into the future. Our conclusion, and it's a view that we've held for some time, is that paradoxically, MAGA is supposed to be about making America great, but ironically, we think it's actually, kind of inadvertently making China stronger. In a world where there's inconsistency coming out of the US, Xi Jinping and his administration seem like the voice of calm and reason. You've seen quite a few countries actively embracing them. And in fact, we just, in the last few days, seen record trade numbers out of China in spite of the tariffs. So clearly, China actively looking to partner with other nations, as those nations themselves are obviously target of US tariffs. So our view is that, the soft diplomacy, for example, that came through organizations like USAID and PEPFAR, all of that subtly is going to probably strengthen China's situation, particularly in Africa. Very quickly, just looking at our, let's call it our scorecard and what we thought in January 25 when we looked forward. I won't go through all of these in any sort of detail, but the bottom line is that we expected it to be quite chaotic. We thought that Trump would probably go quite slowly on tariffs. And although he was very aggressive initially, there has obviously been quite a bit of dialing back. But as you can see there, I think generally we read it quite well. The inflation story, we actually thought it would probably have manifested more by now, but it's early days because the tariffs were spoken of, introduced, then they were rolled back. But we do believe that quite soon you're going to start seeing an economic effect there. And the bottom line is the US is still quite difficult to call. So we've been through the US situation kind of as almost as the driver of what's happening politically, socially, militarily, etc. We just wanted to take a little bit of time to dwell on economic growth, really because we feel that the world actually really needs some growth now. But the question is who's going to deliver it? In January, we spoke at length about some of these peripheral nations, places like Egypt and Bangladesh, and the role that they had played in driving aggregate GDP growth over the last decade. And we just reminded of that, or we'd like to remind you of that, because effectively, although individually emerging economies, with the exception maybe of China particularly, but to a degree India as well, although the rest, if you look in the G20 there, countries like Mexico or Indonesia, they are relatively small individually, but as a collective, as you can see, from a GDP point of view, developing nations, so that's basically everybody other than the developed in the top 20, they represent a very significant 31% of GDP. So although individually they're quite small, collectively they're quite big. And of course, quite interestingly, a lot of them are quite closely linked to China, both actively from an economic policy point of view, but also obviously from a trade, etc. point of view. So effectively, I think what we're saying here is that if the emerging market cluster were to drive growth, that could actually, although it only represents 30%, as we saw in the previous slides, the economic contribution from small countries together with China and India can actually be quite significant. And the reason this is important, we don't expect developed economies to deliver meaningful growth. There you can see the US, the EU, the UK and Japan, all of them very anemic growth rates forecasts for the next year or so, and all of them very much below trend. So it's really then, we believe, down to emerging economies to drive the growth. As you can see there, China, growth rates have slipped from what they were over the previous decade or so, but still forecast to deliver, give or take, about 5%. And obviously, countries like India and some of the other emerging economies are likely to deliver even better growth. And there you can see some of those emerging economies in terms of their GDP relative to the US in 2014 and how significantly those have actually grown in relative terms. But there also you can see not everything is fantastic. You've got the US, as we said, delivering relatively anemic growth. All right, something that we thought was worth dwelling on is just some of the drivers, because we tend to think, particularly in developed economies like in Europe and particularly in the US, the important role that consumer spending, for example, plays, where consumer spending is roughly 70% of US GDP. There are actually other levers that can be pulled, particularly in developing economies. And we just wanted to mention a couple of those. So I think the first thing is the stage of development. I'm going to illustrate that in a second. Of course, another important and very, very powerful force is demographics. Then you've got the general economic upliftment as people go, urbanization and education levels rise and income levels rise. That obviously has quite a powerful multiplier effect. And then modern driver obviously is technology. So we don't want to make this too theoretical, but we thought it was worthwhile just highlighting a couple of these issues. All right, starting with the stages of development. This is very theoretical. This is Rostow's model. But basically, as you can see, as economies evolve from sort of very agricultural, low intensity, all the way through to very technological, those stages of growth result in infrastructure building, capacity building, and effectively the upliftment of populations. As you can see in the second phase of that model, it's very much around capacity building and infrastructure, the critical role that government should play. And then once that sort of infrastructure is there, then you start finding consumer spending and economic upliftment. And that arguably is where China is, which is sort of somewhere between the third and the fourth level. So the point that I'm trying to make is many emerging economies are actually still very low on this, and effectively infrastructure and capacity building alone could actually be a very big driver, particularly because it dovetails quite nicely with the Belt and Road initiative of China, and the role that China wants to increasingly play in emerging economies. And something that's really powerful but is often ignored is just population and population demographics as a driver of growth. I'm going to go through these very quickly. These are very technical slides, some of them, but effectively what we're illustrating on the top there is what is commonly referred to as the demographic dividend, and that is effectively the percentage of the population that is between the ages of 16 and 65 or 64, because really that's the economically active population. As you can see, countries like India and Indonesia have got very young and actively involved populations, whereas if you look at some of those charts, which are difficult to read, obviously, you'll see the percentages of population that are older, obviously in countries like Germany and in Japan, very rapidly aging populations, whereas as we say, in a lot of emerging economies, they've got what they call the demographic dividend. And that graphic on the bottom right really just shows the spending power spread across the classic sort of age groups all the way through from Gen Z to the silent generation. And you can really see it's the baby boomers, that together with Gen X that are the big drivers. So clearly a young and economically growing, economically active population is a very powerful GDP and growth driver. So a little while ago, we illustrated the fact that emerging economies or developing economies in the G20 represented just over 30% of GDP. It's quite interesting if you look at their population, they actually represent 80% of the population, whereas developed economies only contribute 20%. So clearly you can see economies like not only India and Indonesia, but many others like Brazil and Mexico, with quite significant populations, and as we just illustrated, some fairly young populations. So that's the power of big numbers. All right, then, just in terms of economic upliftment and income and the critical role that plays, and this is actually quite an illustrative slide, because what we've got on the left-hand side there, we're basically illustrating minimum wage across different countries. And as you can see, and this is a rate per hour in US dollars. Economies like the UK and Germany, very high minimum income. Even if you look at the US, you're looking around $7-8, still 5 times what it is in China. And that for me is a very powerful illustration on why I think we believe it's going to be very difficult for America to actually capitalize on this trade war actually creating jobs, in part because there's just no jobs. There's already a labor shortage in many parts, but you're not talking about slight differences in wages between America and some of those other higher growth areas like Indonesia and Vietnam. You're talking about factors of 5 times, sometimes 10 times, and even more. So, but importantly, as you can see on the right-hand side there, you can see Chinese minimum wages have grown over the last decade at an average compound growth rate of 8%. And that obviously is ahead of what GDP is doing, and that obviously has been very constructive in terms of positioning people for private consumption. So I hope this is making sense. All of these things combine to actually give emerging economies quite a low base and a lot of optionality in terms of upliftment of population. Then the new game in town, or the new growth engine, is probably technology, and we've seen, and we'll cover it in subsequent videos, on how important it's been in terms of driving asset markets. And the question that one has to ask is if you look long term, who do we think is likely to be the winner in the technology race? And I think it's not an absolute number, but I think what we find really, really instructive here is if you look at the number of people who are studying what they call STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In China and India, you're looking at well over 5 million people. That's factors of the numbers in America and elsewhere. And that really creates almost an unfair advantage because you've just got naturally so much more talent. And that's why we do think that over time you're probably going to find, that generation, what they call about the generational gap between, chips in China and chips elsewhere in the world, particularly obviously what's coming out of the US. We believe that those generational gaps will close, and they may, as we've actually seen in other areas like telecoms, they could actually leapfrog. So, you battle to make an argument for near term, somebody like Huawei, overtaking Nvidia in terms of, their high end equipment. But if you take a 10 or a 20-year view, that's probably a fairly secure bet. And then we've just got across different areas, everything from the lithographers through to the chip makers, the memory makers, and obviously telecoms. And we've seen the how very rapidly and very significantly a lot of these Chinese players have actually managed to close the technology gaps. So we believe long-term technology race will probably be won by emerging economies, just given the sheer power of numbers. Then moving on very quickly to some economic indicators. We're not going to dwell as much as we have in the past because we spent quite a lot of time talking about some of these other factors. Obviously, the dollar is weakening, and the reason we've got this here rather than just in the markets assessment is because it's obviously a reflection of what's happening politically to a degree, but I think it's also, partly a reaction to some of the politics that we are seeing. So, dollar's weakened around 10% against both the both the euro and the pound. Probably seems to have done its thing for now, but it's sort of adding to the argument that maybe the era of US exceptionalism in its purest form is over. Then moving on to inflation, as you can see here from those ridiculous levels when Russia first entered the Ukraine, inflation has moderated, and with the exception of the EU, it's actually remaining sticky and at the higher levels. You can see the forecast as little grey lines. Difficult probably to see in any degree of detail, but the US, we're sitting around 3%, and probably the forecasts are for an acceleration. In the UK, still actually stubbornly high, forecasts are for a lower number, although we'll see if that actually plays out, particularly if we start seeing second round wage inflation. And there you can see, interestingly, Japan, very, very odd, and we'll look at that sort of anomaly in a second in a bit more detail when we look at rates. And in the EU, it's obviously back at the 2% mark, but for the first time in I think it was 8 meetings, the ECB actually held on the last rate call, citing the fact that they'd achieved the target, but that they would be more data driven. This to me is a very interesting slide because it basically is illustrating there what the inflation rate is in each of those economies, and some of this data is a month or so stale, but also then the bank rate, so effectively what the deposit rate you could argue would be. As you can see there, in the US you got deposit rates of, bank rate of around 4.5, from inflation at just under 3, gives you a 1.7%, ignoring any tax. As a real return, you can see in the EU, in Germany, basically no return. In the UK, there is some, and in Japan, just complete anomaly. 0.5% bank rate and inflation running at 3.7. And then you can see China and Australia also around the 1.5 mark. So with the exception of Europe and Japan, which are the outliers, you'd argue probably around 1.5% as a real deposit rate, which we think illustrates that central banks are still very, very accommodative from a monetary policy point of view. As we discussed earlier, GDP is looking better in emerging economies. If you look there, China, obviously the net growth rates come off from 7-8% not so long ago down to around 5. We can see a little bit of a pickup expected in the next few periods. But yeah, India is still holding around the 6% mark. And as you can see, Brazil a little bit disappointing, but another one that's often ignored, but as we've seen, it is a significant contributor, and it's actually got a fairly significant GDP base, is Indonesia, as you can see there, also very much like India, delivering strong growth. So although growth is quite anemic in developed economies, in emerging economies, still quite strong, and forecasts are for those to hold. We discussed this in some detail previously. I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but government debt in the UK, in the US particularly, but also elsewhere in the world, in parts of Europe, also quite worrying. You can see there the number of countries that have got debt to GDP at 100 or more. It's quite an alarming list. The real standout in terms of low debt to GDP, obviously, is Australia, but yeah, the United States, well over 120% and accelerating, a very worrying number. And I think it's one of the things that Trump and his advisors, Scott Bessent and company need to keep in mind is that, you need to continue funding the deficit and rolling the debt, because a lot of the debt is actually shortened in duration, which means you're on a perpetual refinancing cycle. And shortly after Liberation Day, we saw the bond market take a bit of a hit, and we actually believe that that was the driver to cause a little bit of moderation from the administration in terms of tariffs. So our best conclusion is, and I think we would agree with people like Jamie Dimon and Ray Dalio, who are warning that the market is too complacent. They're not seeing some of the risks, we had inflation or tariff second-round effects, but also more recently, of course, threats, veiled threats somewhat, that Trump would look to replace Jerome Powell. All of these things are kind of being almost discounted by the market, and we believe that there's a little bit too much complacency in global markets. And moving on to the local picture, you get the strong feeling that South Africa is really not a Trump favorite. We saw the ambush of our president in the Oval Office. That was pretty unpleasant, and it was probably the one thing that really galvanized South Africans, with the possible exception of the group that was on their way to as refugees to the US, but pretty much everyone else was vocal in their support. And the tariff that was slapped on South Africa, but also other BRICS countries, are somewhat illogical and inconsistent, and particularly for us a bit strange is India being punished for importing Russian crude, but at a time when Trump is negotiating with Putin. So it's weird, you're being punished for doing business with him, but the actual party itself seems to be getting off relatively scot-free. The new conundrum in South Africa, and we always have to have something to keep us busy, is just what our inflation target actually is. There was an idea floated not long ago that South Africa should move away from this 3 to 6% GDP band and rather target a single number. And that number was sort of suggested it being 3%, which is the current lower end of the band. And we all thought this was early days, and they were looking for debate. And then at the last MPC meeting, it looked as though the MPC led by Governor Kganyago had basically adopted the 3% as the new target. And Enoch Godongwana obviously did not agree with that, and that's probably the first time I can recall where Treasury and the SARB have actually had a visible disagreement. We're generally supportive of a single inflation target, but we think we need to grow into 3%. We are not an emerging economy, and I think some nuance is required. Because as we've seen in South Africa, very seldom is our inflation actually demand-driven. It's generally, supply-side inflation. So we think some debate is necessary before we pull the trigger on that. But that's the new conundrum, really. It's just a bit of an argument between Treasury and the Reserve Bank. I'm not going to dwell too much on South African politics. We've discussed this at length and nauseam in previous versions. Our view is that South Africa's political risk is actually moving in large part from national level more to a local level. So we've seen kind of a diffusing of some of the tensions in the GNU. We were able to get through a budget, etc. And now we're seeing that moving more to sort of provincial level and more to metro and council level. And that's really where we see the big political risk right now. Inflation in South Africa is looking very, very encouraging. Although we're not supportive of a near-term 3% target in itself, we're sitting at that level, and very encouraging PPI also is not showing any signs of manufactured push inflation. We spoke earlier about, the rates around the world, and here you can see South Africa very much the outlier with, let's call it, inflation at 3, and our bank rate being the repo as a proxy at 7 gives you a real return excluding any tax at 4%. If you just go back and compare us to one of the higher ones being the US at 1.7, it does suggest that although rates have come off, they are still, in our view, are anchored at the wrong level, and there's probably quite a lot of scope for more monetary policy easing. And it's obviously been encouraging seeing a couple of 0.25% point cuts, but we believe that there's at least scope for another 0.75%, maybe even more, just to get us to a slightly higher or more sensible level. And of course, we know the effect that could have on the economy. So we really do hope that the SARB will continue to be accommodative. In South Africa, the fiscal discipline has been a bit of an issue, particularly since COVID. You can see government spending there looking a lot better, and you can see that also translating into forecasts of debt to GDP actually slowly starting to moderate from sort of the around the 75% debt to GDP mark. So that's also quite encouraging. Also encouraging is the trade and current account. As you can see, our balance of trade tends to be volatile, but generally driven by the combination of lower oil prices but strong precious metal prices, particularly more recently. That's very encouraging, and you can see the current account deficit has narrowed very, very significantly. So that's all quite good. So our conclusion is that it's very much the same story we told in January, that it's not all bad, quite a lot of progress. GNU is holding progress in the parastatals, inflation. We've discussed all of these factors. And maybe we're moving into a slightly more enabling environment. As we also discussed a while ago, there's actually an argument for a higher road scenario for South Africa, and that may not be a pipe dream. And even some of the more vocal critics of government have more recently been talking about the opportunity that exists for South Africa to see a significant acceleration in GDP, although not to sort of the 7%, but to 3% or 4% possibly. And there's some of the reasons for it. And corporate balance sheet and obviously development agency balance sheet are very, very powerful enablers. We believe scope for lower interest rates. Obviously, the mining and tourism sectors are really making a very powerful contribution, particularly to the balance of trade right now, and that's helping the currency. But there was one thing that I, as I was doing a talk a little while ago, it just struck me that there's something, it's like an Agent X that we tend to forget, and that is that South Africa has got a real fighting spirit. And it's probably, Driekus is probably a good, poster child for South Africa, because we're the world champions at getting knocked down to the canvas and getting up again. There's a resilience, and if you just think, I don't want to dwell on this, but if you just think of what has been thrown at the South African economy and the populace over the last, let's say, decade or decade and a half, and just some of the factors shown on that screen there, I don't think many other countries would still be standing. So the fact that we are able to look forward to an acceleration in GDP of these really anemic levels, but an acceleration all the same in spite of tariffs and a lot of headwinds, I think is testament to the fact that we are resilient, and we've got some amazing institutions and corporate balance sheet, as well as a legislative and a regulatory environment that is supportive. So our conclusion then is that South Africa is probably looking a bit better than it has for a while. It's always jumpy and testy, particularly when when there's tension in the GNU. But so far that seems to be holding, and it's starting to feel as though things are looking a little bit more enabling. And I think critical, obviously, still is public-private partnership cooperation and the fixing of the parastatals. So we hope this has been instructive for you. Hope that you've enjoyed it, and we encourage you to please watch the other videos in the series. The next one being the asset market reviews, then the local portfolio, foreign portfolio commentary, as well as our fund. We thank you for your time and attention.